Hello, I'm Steve Handelman. I'm director of the Center on Media Crime and Justice at John Jay College. Welcome to the first session of our webinar, two-part webinar on bail reform in New York and its impact on justice reform in the state and elsewhere. What you're going to see are two separate panels, first in this clip and then in the next clip for our first session on September 16th. We have another one coming up, September 23rd, which I hope you'll register for. This one, we had a slight problem in our recording, so we've lost about 20 minutes of it. We're starting immediately with Khalil Cumberbatch, who's a Council of Criminal Justice Fellow and one of our first speakers. We also want to thank, at the start, the Arnold Ventures for their support of this project. Thanks very much and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
25 years for the murder of his wife, which he did not commit. And in the process of him being basically railroaded by the local district attorney, much of the evidence that would have potentially exonerated him was withheld. And so Texas passed their discovery reforms in the name of Michael. And so we got Michael to do a video. He is someone who is formerly incarcerated. He's a white male. He identifies as a Republican. And so he basically made the video for us and asked two basic questions. Why is it that New York State has yet to pass discovery reform? And what could potentially be the worst case scenario? Meaning that Michael's case was the worst case scenario, that here evidence that could have exonerated him was being withheld, and he ultimately served 25 years. And the individual who actually ended up being convicted for the crime, who did indeed do the crime, murdered another woman. While they were prosecuting Michael, this man was able to remain free and committed a similar harm in a similar fashion. And so that's what NYUJ did. We created this video and a series of videos, and we ran those videos all across the state to really make sure that constituents who were putting fire underneath the elected officials were clear on what these reforms actually were, and more importantly, what they were not. My personal experience with bail comes as, again, as Maurice said in the intro, as someone who's formerly incarcerated. Now, my story with bail is not nearly as tragic as Amy's, and so I won't waste too much time on that. I want to save as much time for her to share her story. But I will say that bail is a tool in New York State that has been misused almost from its very inception. The main goal of bail in New York is to ensure that an individual returns back to a court date. It's essentially a way to put some quote unquote skin in the game for someone who is pending charges to be able to live freely while they are facing the accusations that are made against them. It is one of the most bare-bone constitutional rights given to us by the US Constitution and many state constitutions. But what has happened with bail, in particular cash bail, is that it has been used as a tool to punish people who are legally innocent. I would also be remiss to say that in the midst of fighting a ton of misinformation that was coming out, the role that reporters and media played. I know that today's audience is folks who may have reported on the issue of bail, either in New York or in other states. And the reality is that many reporters, unfortunately, were reporting exactly what was being told to them by district attorneys, by chiefs of law enforcement. And the reality is that they were misinformed. And the reality is that they were running with that information as if it was verified and as if it was tested and true. The reality is that local law enforcement and district attorneys had a vested interest in making sure that the reforms that were passed, particularly around bail, were rolled back or completely repealed. And that's because that is a leverage tool for them. A district attorney's role is to make sure that they secure a conviction. I've yet to come across many district attorneys who say that it is their goal to bring justice. Many of their goals is to make sure that convictions are at a steady pace to justify their existence. And the reality is that bail is a tool that is used to put pressure and leverage on a defendant. And if you put enough pressure and leverage, you can get people to plead guilty to things that they may not have pled guilty to, or things that they actually did not do. And so I would be remiss, again, if I didn't acknowledge the role that media played in spreading misinformation, which largely swayed the public. And and they were the ones who were largely calling for the rollbacks to happen here in New York State, which ultimately did happen.
Let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask the same question to Amy. And I think this is a question that's going to be asked of a lot of panelists today and next week. And that is, how do you respond to people who say we need to be protected from some of these people, and look at the crimes that are being committed? I know that there have been some pushback in terms of this just being sort of out and out fear mongering, but people, I think out there is a concern in terms of, people read about crime because how does it affect me? Is it in my neighborhood? Is it in my where I work? Is it where my kids go to school? And there's a little bit of it there, but for the grace of God go I. But how do you sort of address the fear that people have that what we should be doing is protecting people?
Yeah, I would say that the answer is largely in the question. First of all, you're right. We should be protecting people who are impacted by crime. We should be protecting people who are on both sides, meaning that if someone is accused of a crime, it is important to remember that that individual is legally innocent. As heinous as the crime may be, we cannot start to say that we believe in innocence before guilt, except if you look a certain way, except if you're charged with a certain crime, except if you live in a certain neighborhood. Because the reality is that that is a slippery slope. We need to maintain that same standard across the board. And individuals who are in a pretrial status are exactly that. So I would start by saying that is if we want to hold tight to what the Constitution says about about the rights that are afforded to a person when they are being charged with a crime, then we have to start there. The other thing I would say is that when people say things like, how do we deal with these people? I would challenge that, and I would say, how do we deal with our neighbors? How do we deal with our brothers and our sisters and our uncles and our aunts? Meaning people who are from our community who are charged with crimes. How do we deal with them? Well, we should deal with them in the same way that you would want your uncle and your brother and your aunt to be dealt with which is with a level of humanity, irregardless of what the charges are. I would also say that when most people say things like, how do we deal with these people? And Maurice, this is not necessarily a shot to you. I understand I'm just responding to the question, so please don't view this as a direct shot to you. But when someone says these people, that notion doesn't apply when it's a local official who gets arrested for driving drunk, right? Because it happens, and it happened in the midst of the conversation about rolling back bail. You had a local official who was driving drunk, who was actually a very strong proponent of keeping people safe from people who do drive drunk, was arrested. Now, irregardless of whatever the circumstances were, no one said, we should lock him up and throw away the key. He clearly put everyone at danger. He clearly put everyone at risk. And so therefore we should remand him until we are able to resolve his case. Of course not, because he was an elected official, because he was I would assume largely because he was a white male, he had that privilege extended to him. And so we need to maintain that line, that if we are going to assume that some people are presumptively innocent before guilt is found, then we have to hold that line all across the board. And then lastly, I'll say that we need a system that is equitable. We don't, some can argue to some extent that that we do have some equal access to justice. Now, that doesn't mean that justice is doled out equitably. One could very simply argue and say that because you are not, immediately found guilty when you're charged with a crime, that you do have access to some form of justice. The reality is that we need a system that is equitable as well as equal. And we don't have a system that is equitable. And how that impacts bail is that if you see an individual who is charged with an offense, that individual could be charged in one county and have a different disposition than an individual who's charged in another county could have a completely different outcome. Now, that also rules the same for some people who come in front of the same judge facing the same charges, could have completely different outcomes. Now, not to say that that's not a system that we're aiming for, but all too often the people who are on the short end of the stick in terms of the outcomes that are coming out of the courtrooms of all across the state, many of them, the most punitive outcomes are largely people who are Black and brown. And we have to seriously question what role race plays in terms of how outcomes are doled out, particularly as it relates to bail amounts, particularly as it relates to a person's pretrial status.
Thanks. So, Amy, I'm going to flip that question a little bit. One of the things that we sort of read about, hear about, is what we were just talking about. Someone is granted bail and goes out and commits a crime, another crime, and then, the sky is falling. What we don't hear much is the impact on people who are denied bail and how it actually coerces guilty pleas, perhaps to get out, loss of jobs. There's a cascade, and I wonder if you could, sort of working from your own experience, address that and sort of your arc, your story.
Sure. I'm happy to. Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Amy Jones, and I currently work for Nacy Warner Associates, where I am a justice and anti-racist consultant. I am formerly incarcerated. Let me start backwards, I guess. So I got to this place from organizing, and I got to organizing from advocacy, and I got to advocacy from direct service. So after my incarceration, I started working in direct service in like workforce development, and then working with formerly incarcerated folks, and that has been like the arc of my life since the first part of my life. And the first part of my life was I grew up in foster care and then an adoptive environment. I was born addicted to heroin. I was very sick for the first part of my life. And as I physically got well, I was just never kept safe in the environments that I was in. And as a result of that, I was actually intentionally sex trafficked from the age of 5 until I was 12. And the person that I was basically sold to passed away of cancer. And then I went on with my life a little bit, and then got kind of a reprieve from that lifestyle until my adoptive father began the same activity that the man he had sold me to. So I got like a 3-year reprieve in my life from the age of 5 until 18 from being used physically. And then when I was 18 years old, I graduated high school, and on the day of my graduation, there were bags packed by the door as I came home from my graduation, and I had to leave. I aged out. And from then, I ended up, I was raised in a very suburban adoptive home. And from 18 on, I've lived in poverty, in shelters, in rehabs, in prisons, local jails, all of those things in the city where I live. So I've experienced capitalism, right, in its different forms, and I understood. I began to put together from experience, even if I didn't have language, that poverty becomes criminalized, and about racial capitalism and all of those things. And even though I didn't have a language for it, I had experienced it as someone who grew up in a $500,000 home that we built from the ground up, and then directly the culture shock, the hitting of like a frozen water, then moving into a youth shelter and experiencing poverty and going to social services, and learning how to navigate that as an 18-year-old, and then having children and all of these things, learning how to navigate systems of poverty and being treated so differently than I had, during my lifetime, where even though there was all of this trauma and dysfunction and sexual abuse and gaslighting and all of these things, there was always money. And so then those things were removed. I was on my own, but there was no money, right? And so I began to have to be resourceful on my own. And my very first interaction with the criminal justice system was federal. I was working in a bank at 19 years old, found out I was pregnant, went to social services. I made $9 an hour, too much, to get social services and to get Medicaid and to get help, to get prenatal care, and to bring a baby into the world. And I was 19. I had my first daughter when I was 20. And I felt desperate and overwhelmed and alone, because I was, not because I just felt that way or I was overreacting, because I was. There were no resources for me because I made $9 too much working at a bank. And so I committed a federal crime and took money from the bank because I was afraid. So they called those crimes of survival crimes, right? And I ended up in federal prison and not having my daughter with me. And then I ended up coming home from federal prison and becoming addicted, becoming more entrenched in like financial crimes, fiduciary crimes, things of that nature. And it just spiraled and spiraled. And I went just deeper and deeper into this world because of trauma, because of a broken heart, because I was never kept safe, because I had no support, zero. And so I took care of myself, right? And so my bail story, the most tragic part of my bail story is that after I had my second child, I was very deeply into my addiction, and 6 weeks after my second daughter was born, my children are 8 years apart, 6 weeks after my second daughter was born, I ended up in jail and could not get back out because I had been on probation, just all of these things. And my family decided that instead of bailing me out, they were going to help me by taking my daughter. And so they came from California. They took my daughter. I'm sorry, this is my biological family, whom I met when I was 26 years old. So my biological family came and took my daughter, and she turned 21 in July, and I've seen her probably 5 or 6 times in our lifetime. She ended up staying with them for the rest, for her childhood up till now. She's fine. She's at Cal State East Bay. She's in her 4th year. She's thriving. We have a great relationship, but I didn't raise her. And there's that hole in her life of why. There's that hole in my life that I didn't get to raise her. Especially as someone, an adoptee and a foster person, a person who's experienced the foster system and an adoptee and the trauma that brought. I had a great deal of shame of being absent from my children's lives for any period of time. Okay, 15 minutes until the next panel. Okay, so that's how bail rips families apart. I told you my whole story just to give that these people are me, and people have stories and context, and their backstories have backstories, and I am these people, and that's why I am the fiercest advocate for these people and those people. So I'll end there.
Well, let me ask you, can you tell me what exactly you have done up in Albany relating to bail reform?
Okay, so I fought for a year and a half with all of the coalition for the pretrial justice reforms. We fought at the Capitol, we fought outside of the Capitol. I did a statewide commercial with forward.us. I fought our local DA, David Soares, who was the head of the District Attorney Association, who fought a racist, regardless of his race. He fought a racist fear-mongering campaign against the rollbacks. And as early as Friday, I now run not a bail fund, but not a structured bail fund, but I call it a radical safety fund, and I bail people out of jail. Pre-trial, and because of the rollbacks, I bailed 2 people out on Friday who are high risk for COVID. A woman who is in 3rd stage cancer, has an open port for chemotherapy, is 95 pounds soaking wet, probably doesn't have that much longer to live, has a 16-year-old son, and she had a $10,000 bond. I got a hold of the bail bondsman, I signed it myself, and I gave him $1,000. That's what I know to do. I know direct service. If I'm gonna bang on the door of the person in power, and at the same time, I'm gonna create power where there wasn't any.
Well, wow, thank you. Before I would like to leave time and open up for questions. And in fact, there is one question that comes from one of our attendees that says, in Boston recently, due to acceleration of donations to a bail fund for all there, because of protests and such, had enough funds to bail out a person charged with rape who then was released, then got released and raped again. And they're asking, how do we avoid this and still be equitable? Is there some way? And it really comes down to, I know there have been models that have been set up to try to determine who is best suited for bail. But I'm wondering, Khalil and Amy, what your thoughts are on a question like that.
Yeah, I'll just say that, well, first, let me just say that, again, an individual charged with a crime has a legal right to be deemed innocent before any level of guilt is leveraged on that person. Second, this kind of notion of zero-sum game, that we have to figure it out right, otherwise other people will be harmed. And if we can't do that, then let's just not do anything in the meantime, or let's do the most punitive thing in the meantime. That whole notion, that whole ideology doesn't apply to any other sector in this world. For example, no one would say, well, one Volkswagen crashed and burned, the brakes failed on it. Let's just punish all Volkswagens, burn them all, until we figure this out exactly right. And that's not to minimize the harm that may or may not have been caused in this specific example given. But what I'm trying to highlight is that we need to have a penchant for risk in terms of creating an equitable system, meaning that there will be people who go on to commit other harms. And not to say that those individuals can't or shouldn't be held accountable, but punishment is different than accountability. And we really do need to figure out a system where we have the penchant for risk to be bold enough to create a system that addresses what every individual involved in a crime needs, including the perpetrator, including the person who commits the harm, while at the same time understanding that the current system that we have is just not working. It's just not working in the way that it is intended to work. And that includes bail, that includes things like discovery, and it includes things like speedy trial.
Let me ask another question and direct this to Amy, but you can also, both of you have strong voices. And I think, what do you want to see? Well, I'll ask two questions. First, if the media were to reach out to you, would you be able to not only address this, but also put them in touch with people who have been adversely affected or have been positively affected by the bail reform? And secondly, what do you really want to see from the media in the coverage of the bail reform? I mean, what are there stories that aren't being told that you think should be told?
The media does reach out to us. Khalil and I have been working on this issue for a very long time. And we can, and story collection is a big part of organizing and advocacy. We can put them in touch with people who have been adversely and adversely affected by bail reform. I don't know what you mean by positively, like maybe they didn't have, a bail was not imposed upon them, but yes. I want the media to be responsible. I want them to not be, I don't want them to gaslight people. I want them to be responsible and look past dog whistling, and I want them to recognize dog whistling, racist dog whistling when they see it, and I want the media to stop being racist. And I want them to look into critical race theory and understand why our country is where it is right now, understand the legitimacy of the voice of dissent, and stop being willfully obtuse. And it is not up to us, people of color, Black folks, marginalized genders, who are disproportionately affected by the racist war on drugs, over policing, who are disproportionately affected by that. It is not up to us to beg you to see our humanity any longer, and that's not the approach that we're taking. We are mobilizing, we are organizing, and we're creating power and equity ourselves through direct action and mutual aid. So that is what I would. That's what I expect from today's media at this point.
What do you think, Khalil? Yeah.
I would add very briefly, one, just to say that I agree with everything that Amy just said, and I would just add that language is important. The language and the terms that we use to refer to people who are in the criminal justice system, people who may or may not have committed harm or crimes, that we continue to refer to them in a way that acknowledges the fact that they're human beings, irregardless of what they're charged for. And again, I'm going to highlight that because it's a very slippery slope, and it's easy to say someone who is charged with a gun offense, throw that person away. But someone who is charged with an offense that is quote unquote lesser than that, then maybe that person has some access to justice. That's just not how our justice system was designed to operate. It was designed to ideally operate in a way where every single person has some equitable access to justice. And so I would reference a point where the Associated Press, if there's anyone here from the Associated Press, please take this and run with it. The Associated Press about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe somewhere around there, the Associated Press said, we are no longer going to use the term illegal as it's used to refer to people who are here undocumented. We realize that that is a term that cannot be placed on a human being, and we won't use that term, period, anymore. Surprise, surprise, the Associated Press says that. Every single other outlet now follows suit, and most of them will not use the term illegal. They will use the term undocumented. I challenge the Associated Press and others to do that as it relates to people who are charged in the criminal justice system, people who are caught in the criminal justice system, and people who have been convicted of crimes. Because someone would refer to me as an ex-felon, and I would dare to challenge that and say that I'm more than that. That only encompasses one part of my life.
There is a question here that says, can either of you speak to how to combat the messaging that crime is rampant in New York and that it's all laid at the feet of bail reform? How do you fight that message? How would journalists fight that message?
Well, I would say that the New York Post, surprisingly, did an investigative journalist piece that refutes all of that. So your colleagues already did that. They crunched the data that was given by the NYPD, and they basically said that one individual who was charged ultimately with a gun offense, and not to say that that individual was involved in a gun shooting, but that individual was in possession allegedly of a gun. And so I would say that the New York Post has already done that. And there's not many times personally that I can reference a New York Post article and actually feel like they did some justice. But the reality is that in this case, they did do some investigative journalism and crunched the data that the NYPD provided them.
Amy, you want to weigh in on that?
I just plus one everything that Maurice said, and it's very, very true. Like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to want to be factual in your research and your reporting.
We are going to have coming up people who can address the data. I do believe that data are very, very important instead of just relying upon talking heads and making it a he said, she said, because I think then that the reader doesn't really have much, get much guidance or discernment in terms of what is true and what is not true and what is accurate and what is inaccurate. We've got just a couple of minutes. I'm going to give you each a chance to make any kind of final pitch to thinking of journalists here who are going to go forward and hopefully write cogently, accurately, and with some discernment on this issue. And why don't you start, Amy?
I just believe that it is time to become humane in a time when our world, like the juxtaposition of where we are is like, it is literally inhumanity, everyone in power, right? It is inhumanity versus humanity. And whatever is in between, we have to move. We have to continue to push back against this inhumanity, where all the power lies, right? And bring humanity to it. Just remember when you're reporting that there are people behind this, literal people. Like, you may not believe, if I was walking past you in the street, or you looked at my rap sheet, or someone told you something about me, Amy, you'd be like, because you don't believe I have any structural power. My grandfather worked on affirmative action with Robert F. Kennedy, was a Harvard PhD, and was a macroeconomist who helped found the Sloan School of Management at MIT and worked under 5 presidential administrations. He has structural power. I don't, but my grandfather isn't any more. My grandfather's humanity doesn't mean more than mine.
Agreed. Khalil?
Just to say that, to be fair, all too often, line reporters are the ones that want to capture the humanity and use the right terminology. But once it gets kicked up to an editor, they're the ones that say, oh, well, this term is too much, this needs to be. So I would urge the budding reporters that to stand in your power in those moments as much as possible, as much as would make sense given your circumstances. And if you ever become an editor, that you think about that. You think about the power that you wield in supporting line reporters who do want to get it right, who do want to actually highlight the humanity of individuals. And again, I would lean back to terminology. I think that any term that is used that does not acknowledge the fact that this is a human being is a term that we should be rid of as it relates to criminal justice reform. And again, given the example used for talking about immigration in this country, but also, you look at other examples in the medical field, they no longer refer to someone who has diabetes as a diabetic. They say this is a person who has diabetes, a person who is living with HIV and AIDS. That's because they themselves also realize the power of terms and how limiting they can be, or how, once you remove them, how empowering that can be, not only for the individual, but for the system at large.
I want to thank you both for an incredible session. I really appreciate both of your voices. We are running out of time, and we've tried to put a quart into a pint container here as best we can. I'm going to turn it over to Steve, but I really appreciate it. And I know that we will be making your contact information, your emails available to people who want to contact you and reach out and perhaps pursue further discussions and particularly the media. I think I join with everyone in saying, well done, thank you.
Thank you, Amy and Khalil, for a great opening. I just want to add that if anybody has more questions for either Khalil or Amy, just let us know, and we will certainly send it to them. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break before we move into the next session. And I just wanted to make the point that we are recording this session, so it will be available on the cloud. As soon as I get a link, I'll send it around to everybody on our call. So we'll take a quick break now, and we'll put our logo on and then get back to you in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone.